We're living through a period of history right now. I don't think a lot of people in it kind of see that.
Price is a universal medium. Is cost savings like the primary objective of procurement?
99% of the work was the preparation and then the implementation. I don't think the world needs another e-sourcing tool.
Jason, thank you for joining the podcast. It's great to see you again, as always. Do you want to give the audience a little bit of a background on who you are and how you came to the world of procurement, where you are right now? It looks like maybe Wisconsin, and a little bit about what you're working on today.
Sure thing. So it's nice to be home or in the office and have a good recording studio. I am not in that place right now. I'm actually at my mother's house. Thank goodness she's in good health still. But
hmm
a few people in my family have gone to Madison, including my brother-in-law and my wife. So we've got the Go Badgers sign up there. But I have a son currently in IU. So there's a big football game coming up in a few weeks between IU and Wisconsin. So you can guess who I'll be cheering for. So I like to describe myself as a failed historian. I went to undergraduate and graduate school in history and somehow got booted outside of the academy 30 some years ago and got into business. And lo and behold, I somehow got pulled into the gravitational orbit of procurement and supply chain. And I've been there ever since. And I don't know if that's a punishment for being a failed academic or whether that was a good thing. But lo and behold, it's been a fascinating journey. I've thought about my career retrospectively, which is kind of a horrible thing, right? Because I hopefully have 20 or 30 years left of this career. But it's been bookended so far by being in the startup world. And, the bulk of it has been being a researcher and analyst in the middle. I enjoy all sides of it. And it's really fun to build technology in this space. And it's also really fun to step back and look at it and try and examine what it all means.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. It's very exciting stuff. I don't know if you know this. I don't think we've ever talked about it, but we are both alumnus of the University of Pennsylvania. I was a class of 2014 and I was my class president. I'm not a former donor, I'm still a donor. But did we ever talk about this? Was this ever
You're going to rub in. I'm not going to say what year I am. Let's just say it was a different century. But I had no
uh
idea we both went there. I'm sure you as well. I had a phenomenal experience. I got what's called my terminal masters at Penn when I
yep.
didn't go on with a PhD, but I did my undergraduate as well. And it was fantastic. I think the academy has changed a lot since we were a part of it, but I have fond memories of Locust Walk and West Philadelphia, downtown Philly.
hmm it's funny because I've always really liked you, Jason, and now learning that you're also a Quaker, the which is the mascot of the university, I think explains a little bit more. But yeah, no, I love Penn. My last name is Penn, in fact, so I don't think that hurt with admissions. It's funny. There was a guy, the dean of admissions was this guy Dean Furta, and I once had an opportunity to meet him, and I said, I sort of asked him like, look, Dean Furta, I've always been curious. Do you think my last name had anything to do with my admission? Because there's so many high schoolers and their resumes all look pretty similar. And so, do you think that maybe my name could have gotten me from, like, of course, I'm not, wholly unqualified, but could it have gotten me from, the maybe pile to the incremental yes? And he thought for a second and said, no, because your year we had someone apply named Benjamin Franklin and we rejected him. So I think you got in on your own. But no, I also love the university, and of my three younger siblings, two of them went to Penn also after me, and I also did a terminal master's. We called it a submatriculation. So I was Wharton undergrad and then master's in engineering. And so I skipped the liberal arts side. So between the two of us, we've got the full school covered except for nursing. But no, Locust Walk. I mean, I go back all the time. I was in Philly a week and a half ago for a wedding, actually, and I made sure to stop by and get some good cheesesteaks. And I've really fond memories. I really quite love the university. I plan a lot of our reunions. I'm still involved, and I really was close with Amy Gutman back when she was still the president. I thought she was just such a phenomenal leader of the university. But I'm just I looked at your LinkedIn and I noticed it. I was like, how have we never talked about this? It just was like such a missed overlap. Were you in a fraternity at the university?
No, that was not for me. I was a lot less fun back then. I was focused a lot on studying, on research. I had the chance to edit a bunch of books when I was in college. I got in trouble a lot too. I was an editor of the then libertarian conservative paper, the Red and Blue. We had our offices rated. It wasn't the school somehow didn't like people speaking the truth if it was not the progressive dogmatic academic truth. And so I did a lot there. My graduate advisor, who also oversaw my thesis, was a guy named Bob Ings, and he introduced me a lot to working with primary material. Bob died
Hmm.
10 or 15 years ago. Fascinating guy. He was actually the one responsible for telling me to not go on in history. I loved it. I think I had a knack for it, but it was a time when if you were a white male and God forbid a white, libertarian conservative male in the academy, God forbid you were also Jewish, it was not it was not a good job market. I suppose you could go to Hillsdale or a place like that, but he joked around with me and said, someday you can endow a chair for me. We'll get your ass out of here and get into business. So that started my path into consulting and then the tech scene in procurement. But it was, yeah, I think the problem for so many students is that they have this view of college that, you party, you might have been a member of a fraternity, you work hard, you play hard, you do a sport, whatever it is. But I think, the ultimate experience, even today, especially today, when we're not sure what the job market is going to be for grads in the future, is just to make it your own. So, through Bob, I got to work with a ton of Civil War source material, reams and reams of letters from the front. And it was just fantastic. I proofread a few books. My undergraduate advisor was Drew Faust. I think I might have proofed one of her books as a research assistant. So I was much more an academic back then. I was not as much fun as I am today, hopefully. But yeah, it was just a great experience. I was very lucky to go there.
That's amazing. No, it is a great university, and it's funny. So Drew Faust, just to add a little bit of additional context, was the president when I started my MBA at Harvard, and so yeah, there's a lot of sort of funny small connections, and so Robert Eng's focused on Civil War and Reconstruction. Was that also your focus area?
It was. I mean, I've always loved world history. Penn had some pretty stringent requirements for languages if you were going to
Hmm.
take us outside the US, and my language skills are quite horrible. So I by I by default had to do American history, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. So, and I find now living through the period we're living in, which is absolutely crazy, right? We have two political parties which don't at all resemble what they were even a decade ago. We've had the hot swap of the parties, and these things have played out in history to some degree as well. But we're living through a period of history right now. I don't think a lot of people in it kind of see that. I do think having an appreciation for what's happened in the past and not jumping to conclusions until you have a lot of source material and data can really help you put things in perspective as well as a builder, uh, but also to understand the implications of what you're doing. And I followed my passions at different points in life. When I was at Free Markets, which was the first tech company I worked for after consulting, and I just did a
Yeah.
podcast with the founder, one of the co-founders of it, Sam Kinney, interviewing him on what we build and why and all of that. I was not level headed when I joined Free Markets. I was passionate, and I was a zealot for what we were doing. We could see at the time the notion of reverse auctions and creating competition where it didn't exist in the form, to me, was really valuable. But the lasting legacy of it had nothing to do with auctions. Actually, auctions were somewhat of a fad in the end, but it was about creating level playing fields between different suppliers, having better data flow back and forth, something I know you're doing at Lightsource with bills of material and other data. Back in the day, it didn't have level playing fields. Incumbents had far more access to information. In fact, lots of companies in manufacturing, I mean, even today, a lot of bids are rigged, not financially so, but design engineers want to, see certain suppliers get the awards. And Free Market's ultimate legacy to me was we were really good at specifying requirements and communicating them.
Yeah, tell me more about that. What do you mean by specifying requirements?
In the past, if you had, and I'll put it in the old fashioned speak, if we were sourcing 200 printed circuit boards, we might create, 7 or 8, 7 to 10 watt structures or groupings of printed circuit boards based on, logical bunches of suppliers who could bid on them. And or we might create a super lot as an alternative. But in the past, the incumbent suppliers may have had it may or not have been privileged information, but they had a greater understanding of what it took to build those PCBs or PCBAs. And you can
Right.
swap out a metal casting or forging or a finished component in automotive. It doesn't, matter. And often what happened was, you had design engineers make decisions which were not based on trade-offs, and that limited your supply base. And if you wanted to expand it through making slight tweaks or variations or expand it geographically, there would often be pushback in the engineering organization. And procurement had to come in after the fact. So what we did, we were really good at free markets at communicating specifications. So we would create literally these massive bid packs. These were like this big. And we would mail them out. It was before the day of giant files. You could send. We would send out design drawings. We would have we called them market making engineers answer engineering questions from suppliers. So by the time bid day came around, suppliers were incredibly well prepared to bid. They knew exactly what they were bidding on, and they knew how far they could go. And we did that to enable the auction. But I think the irony of all of it is that the lead up to the auction is what enabled the outcome. And even though
Yeah.
auctions got a bad rap, I think because a lot of people use them incorrectly, the process we went through to enable the auction became really the basis of not only modern, direct material sourcing technology, but even the extension of PLM into, direct materials collaboration solutions.
Hmm.
So, that to me was the legacy of that company, besides spreading free markets, which is what we were about.
Yeah, why do you feel that e-auctions did not persist longer term? You called it a fad, and I tend to agree with that perspective, but I feel in some ways there are certain businesses that because we get asked about e-auctions all the time, and whether or not we do them. And my response is usually to ask the question like, well, how many e-auctions are you running? And then 9 times out of 10, the response will be, well, none, but we want to have the capability to do it if we want to. But then there are 1 out of 10 businesses like BASF or Walmart or Amazon, where they're actually running like a good number of auctions, maybe just because of their scale or the kinds of commodities that they're buying. So I'm kind of curious, why have e-auctions gone the way of the sort of dodo?
I think when auctions stick, and you referenced some organizations with a long history, I think, of successful direct materials procurement, Amazon being more recent, but being a very strong organization too. So if you look at the auction itself, you can think of it, we got to go back to calculus and waves. It's like, I'm going to use the incorrect mathematical term here, but it's the crescendo of the wave, right? So all the work occurs before and after to make an auction work. The issue with
Hmm.
auctions in so many companies is they had no idea that all the work, 99% of the work was the preparation and then the implementation. So
Right.
if you don't prepare properly and you don't implement properly, you may identify the savings, but they may never become realized savings, or they will get eroded over time. A lot of people looked at free markets. I could go back to old names in the field, Commerce Bid, within Commerce One, Procuri and Taurus. All these companies started building self-service technology that, copied a lot of what we were doing. I remember at free markets, we lawyered up because we had a ton of IP
Right.
around different auction formats, and we would sue some of these people for infringement at the time. But what they did is they put that IP into self-service tools, which didn't require what we would call full service or market making at free markets. And so what happened was organizations skipped the preparation steps and they skipped the post auction steps to drive successful implementation. So therefore, auctions got a bad name in lots of companies because on bid day,
Hmm.
you might get 5, 10, 30, 40% savings, but it would never become realized. So, there was one other company like free markets, which was lost to the annals of procurement history, Abbreviate, which was a spin out of AT Kearney, they did some of this successfully because Kearney was services driven. A lot of the work that is now done today that's successfully implemented with negotiations is still done by large consultancies on direct materials, simply because whether or not there's an auction, there's tremendous preparation. And most procurement
Right.
teams, for direct spends still don't go through that level of prep necessary to get the most out of an auction.
Right, it makes sense. I mean, look, this is a lot of the reason why, we're focused on that PLM connection. And if you've read the sort of spec to scale manifesto, that's the first step, right? Is the spec alignment and just being able to even describe to the suppliers what it is that you're asking them to quote. If you can't do that, then they can't provide you with bids. And so, the problem is if you don't have your data, ducks in a row, that work of doing the preparation for the event becomes like a monumental transformation task versus if you can actually have software and tooling that makes all of that information available to you, then it can be done relatively quickly. The interesting thing about an auction is I think the precision also just has to be a lot higher because if the preparation is done, you know, perfectly, then the auction can run smoothly. If the preparation is done, but then there's blemishes or like, oh, that part doesn't have a drawing or, that specification isn't clear, you don't have a lot of opportunity or time to fix it before the auction starts to fall apart and people can't participate versus an RFQ where you're iterating multiple rounds. There's sort of like, I think about it sort of mathematically also like an RFQ as an RFQ's number of rounds approaches infinity, it becomes an e-auction. You know what I mean? Like it becomes a real-time auction if you have enough rounds and enough bid feedback. And so the line does get a little bit blurred, but I do think of RFQ as like an e-auction, but with a little bit bigger margin for error on the preparation side. It doesn't fail because you can hustle people along without it being like time's up.
Totally. And I've become, I'll say from a geek perspective, enamored over the years of essentially taking sourcing optimization technology, with constraints and solvers and running scenarios, and then also being able to provide feedback to suppliers to adjust their bids competitively based on the constraints you might be applying. Few providers have gone down that path. I know, we're even in overlapping spaces today at my startup Gain, but the work that, and I'll just, give credit to where credit was due. CombinedNet started out doing a lot there. It's now, owned by Jagger. It hasn't done a lot with that asset in terms of R&D relative to what Coupa's done with ASO and Keelvar, and
Hmm.
lots of others. So I think that is a fascinating area for direct as well. But again, I think you're right. I think you go back to bridging that gap between design engineering through PLM, specification, sharing, and then just, the rapid iteration and back and forth process. So, and bear in mind, we had lots of different people involved on the procurement side, and then we have different people involved on the supplier side. So, whether it's a massive CapEx project, to build out a battery factory, or whether it's,
Yeah.
a wire harness, it's still different groups of people involved. So that collaboration piece becomes totally key. And I think too, as well, where we can both get into with how AI evolves a bunch of this, it's a huge efficiency gain. And,
Mhm.
whether in my new startup, we're driving to autonomy for a lot less complexity compared to what you're doing at Lightsource. But the notion is, can you build autonomy with or without human in the loop, depending on the organization? Still, you need good data. You need to ensure its accuracy. You need to over communicate that with suppliers all the time. You need to be able to answer questions. You need to remove doubt. And then, you need to remove any latency in the process, whether that is
Mm.
pre-bid, post-bid, implementation, and the like. So I still think it's just a golden opportunity. I don't think the world needs another e-sourcing tool. There's been a few of those over the years. But again, if you think about sourcing as kind of that crescendo, it's everything that comes before and everything that comes after that makes the
Right.
beauty of that negotiation a great outcome.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, how do you think about applying this mindset to something that is more of an RFP than an RFQ? Because I think if you have perfect
Mhm.
information that you're sharing with suppliers, okay, makes much more sense that you can have competitive events. But a lot of times what we find is also that folks will say, okay, you know, we're not at the scale where we're going to own every single part of our design, or maybe it's just a service and actually it doesn't have a SKU associated. I mean, how do you keep RFPs really competitive when it's really a proposal that's coming from the supplier side?
It's a great question. I will answer that, but I'll take it in a slightly different direction. So I was obsessed at free markets. I nearly pulled off an acquisition when I was in corporate development
Okay.
28 years ago. I wanted to acquire a company called Hologix. It turned out we ended up using it in a commercial pilot. We couldn't get it to work as we wanted to. But the idea was, and we were focusing on much more basic stuff than you guys do today primarily, and certainly we do at Gain. But matching, for example, a fabrication shop's equipment with potential outputs. So they have a certain number of machines and a certain skill set, or you take a plastic injection molded shop and their equipment. So what theoretically could they produce based on that equipment? Not that they're producing today. Or maybe you
Hmm.
bring in, in the case of metals, even a third party to provide a finish or coating after, because essentially, I mean, if you look at a metal part, you essentially have input, you somehow transform the part with heat or with pressure or by cutting, and then you can coat it, you can put it into an assembly. There's only so much you can do with it. So theoretically, what can a machine do and what can a shop do? And then you take a defined buyer requirement, a part specification, and can you map a part or a finished product specification to the machine capability of suppliers? So
Right.
I was utterly fascinated by that. I worked with Sam Kinney and a few other people to see if we could make it work, and we were too early. I think AI has the potential to make that capability, going back to the RFP, that a request for proposal is really, you could rephrase it as a request for potential, right? What what is the what is the potential you can bring to me as a partner in this? You may or may not, based on your PPAP process or other requirements, depending on your industry, be able to change the part specifications, change change the metal composition, a slightly different alloy, change a coating. But maybe you can. And again, it depends so much on what it is, you're ultimately making in terms of finished product. But I think with AI, the potential
Hmm.
for RFPs to be that much more valuable, because the whole notion is I am not locking in necessarily exactly what I want to get back, right? I want to bring your capability and creativity, and maybe our true north is cost savings. Maybe our true north is some other aspect, So it's fascinating.
It is interesting. I mean, I think that you've just triggered a whole nother topic area, which is cost savings like the primary objective of procurement. And that's a topic that's extremely hot. And I don't mean hot like it's well explored now. I mean it's hot like it's nobody wants to really touch that because at the end of the day, there's a lot of value that procurement can bring beyond cost savings, and people don't want to think of ourselves as just negotiators. But I do feel that price is a universal medium, right? And so I can solve any problem within a business with money. And so at some level, like you have to have some kind of common currency to describe things like performance. And it's funny because even at Tesla, we had a trade-off that we would make for the engineering team. We'd say, an engineer would come to me and say, hey, I can make this part out of aluminum instead of steel and it will be lighter. Okay, that's great. We want to reduce vehicle mass. That is like a specification that we are tracking. We had a bill of materials with cost. We also had a bill of mass, right? So we're always tracking, is the car getting heavier or lighter? Now, why do you track that? Because if the car is heavier, then you're reducing the range. You might miss some other functional spec, but you could also fix the range issue by just putting more battery cells in there, right? And which makes the car more expensive. And so on the finance team, we came up with an equivalency, which was dollars per kilogram. So if you can remove 1 kilogram from the car, we will spend $3 extra per vehicle on that. So if you show me that it's less than $3 that you're saving by adding mass, you can't add the mass. If you're reducing mass, but it's costing more than $3, then we won't approve it either. Now the funny thing is, I once met my counterpart at SpaceX, and they had their own number, and you can imagine that it was like I don't remember the exact number, something like $500 per kilogram, something insane like that, because their cost basis is they're launching a rocket into space, and
80 to 90% the cost of a rocket is the fuel to get it into space, right? Like the payload,
Yeah.
the amount of weight you can carry is a fraction of the fuel weight and cost.
Exactly, exactly. So that's why over there they were doing all this incredible material science research on carbon fibers and additive manufacturing and 3D weaving and stuff. And it was always much harder for us at Tesla to justify that because, I mean, frankly, a stamping machine and an injection mold machine, very, very efficient on a cost basis. But I guess, sorry, so circling back, something I'm curious about. So I think that, okay, RFQ, we talked about that. You have a very clear specification. You're just really pushing the suppliers to compete on price. RFP indirect in the direct space, we're saying, hey, we have a functional spec we need to get to, but we're opening the aperture a little bit of the things that we're willing to consider as supplier provided solutions. Now, the drawback, of course, is that if you choose a supplier's solution, you don't have a lot of competitive pricing leverage at that point because the point is that this is the solution that they've proposed, that they've created. What about RFPs in the indirect side? I'm curious, what do you think that the indirect world could learn from the direct materials world as someone who spent so much time there? Because a lot of times I do feel like indirect, it sort of has sometimes like a lot of the best tools in technology in the form of like the S2P intake and orchestration players, but also it's sometimes I feel that the kinds of things people are buying are so varied that it ends up maybe not having the level of specificity that it needs. And so I'm kind of curious, what do you think? I don't mean to prime the pump too much and bias you, but what do you think are some things that the indirect world could learn from direct materials?
I'll back up in terms of indirect and talk about the unstated purpose of these e-procurement solutions going back to Ariba and through to Coupa and others today. When a company puts them in, provided there's some oversight, do you know often the first thing that happens if there hasn't been one before?
No, what happens?
People buy less because they're being monitored. So
Hmm.
there's no stockpiling of toner. There's nobody upgrading a notebook every year or two. So in theory, a watch clock, does behave differently. We could go quantum mechanics around this as well. But indirect, how much of indirect spend is really necessary? The answer is probably a significant portion of it, but then we can get to over what time horizon. If the coffee maker breaks, yes, we're going to have a productivity loss, and Light
Yeah.
Source's R&D team, especially at 2 a.m. But, at the same time, the Starbucks is around the corner or Insomnia Cookies. So I think I look at indirect. I'll answer the question differently. I look at indirect as a completely different animal than direct, and direct also is different by industry, right? To me, direct is what is like the lifeblood of what you ultimately produce. It could be ingredients in the food space. It could be, the importance of packaging and CPG products, and certainly in manufacturing, the two of us have had a lot of experience in our years on all the areas to build a car or an airplane and everything that goes into it, from raw and semi-finished materials into components. The issue with indirect is that how a business operates, what its requirements are with indirect. The factory is not going to shut down if you cut the T&E budget. Now, is cutting the T&E budget a good idea? Shutting it off has happened in so many former recessions. It depends. There's probably a ton of extraneous travel, which is not necessary, but some of it is hugely strategic. You might miss a deal because your rep is not going out and socializing something early enough. So I think indirect ultimately becomes much more of a demand management game and also one of a multi-channel game as well. So, not only, are we looking for preferred buying channels, my old colleague Pierre Mitchell at Spend Matters, and now Hackett, after Hackett, 25 years ago, coined the phrase guided buying. You want to guide buyers to the best choice for them, which is in line with the company's standards. Direct is much more about direct engagement with the end supplier, whether you're beating them up on price, whether you're asking for creativity, whether you're designing a supply chain with multiple suppliers, versus indirect, which is aligning what a user really needs, also questioning if they need it, with different paths to get there. So yeah, that could be a punch out catalog. That could be a punch out catalog tied to a GPO contract and a rebate on the back end. And that could be the complexity of corporate services and travel. It could be a bunch of things, but it's wholly a different animal. And I came at indirect much later in my career. At free markets, we focused on direct. We would often poo-poo indirect, right? I mean, that's what Ariba, Commerce One do, and Medium, and Telesys, and all those guys back in the day. But it's still a huge amount of spend, and there's tremendous potential value in going after it.
Makes a ton of sense. Well, I know that we're about at time, Jason. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you feel that I should have asked or you would have expected me to ask?
I guess there's a question in manufacturing is do we need procurement at all? I'm focusing more in my new startup on retail and CPG and food, grocery, those areas, which is new for me. It's interesting learning. And the answer is, do you need a merchandising function in the future with AI? You probably still do. But in manufacturing, does procurement matter anymore? And I think when you have a team of super design engineers and a crack supply chain team, and with better data and AI in the middle, is procurement just creating friction? I don't have the answer, but I think that's the question I would have asked. And I don't know how to answer it if you did.
Okay, it's interesting. I mean, look, like all questions that are difficult to answer, probably the truth is the nuance, right? That in certain circumstances, the answer is absolutely procurement is an obstacle, and in certain places, a great procurement person is worth their literal weight in gold. And also, to some degree, it depends on the outcomes, right? Like, I don't want, it's sort of funny. Like, I remember, I had a friend of mine who is at Airbnb, and the way that they viewed the functions at Airbnb was that engineering was like the prize team, and that many of the other functions around were designed to specifically get as much off the engineer's plate as possible that wasn't just them coding and working on the product. And it's very, when you have a very selective, high talent, high comp group, sometimes it's worth surrounding them with enablement, right? And we see this with sales, right? You bring around sales, revenue operations, solutions engineering. I don't want my sellers doing invoice receipts. I want that to be, on accounting. And so in some ways you might ask the question, like, could a design engineer go and be a cost modeler and go and do sourcing and RFQs when it only would make up 5% of their day and they might just not be used to it? I do think there is value in specialization, and certainly in the automotive arena, which is a place where we play a lot. They don't have teams of like 5 procurement folks like a lot of businesses do. We're talking about like 500, and it's not maybe they could get away with 490, but it's not a mistake to have the function in its entirety, I think.
I want to close by asking you a question.
Sure.
It's not so much a procurement one, but it's one you've lived at Tesla and elsewhere. Aside from Tesla, does the US have an automotive industry in 30 years?
That is a really good question. I think the answer to that question, I think, may be solved by a different question, which is that I don't believe in 30 years there will be such a thing as personal car ownership anyway. And so then I think it will end up being that there's a transition toward autonomous modes of transport that are owned by businesses that are primarily in the arena of servicing. I sort of have this view of, I'm a big Clayton Christensen fan. I've read a lot of his stuff. I went to Harvard Business School. Of course, he's a bit of a small deity there, even posthumously. And there's this curve that I love, which is the levels of integration versus modularity against the state of a technology. And so right now, the state of autonomy is underperforming where people want it to be. It's gotten a lot better, but it's not perfect. And so the solutions that really win there are the high cost, sophisticated, fully integrated end-to-end solutions where they can just get slightly better, but closer to narrowing the performance gap. Then eventually it'll be that, okay, autonomy is ubiquitous and it's not actually that special, not that interesting. And then what people will compete on are other things like, can we be very efficient, or can we have service delivery models that are better than others? And what that'll mean to me is that the industry sort of breaks apart to a place where you have these service providers. Maybe you have networks like Waymo's already feeding into Uber and Lyft as a network. And then what's going to end up happening is we're going to have a financial instrument, you and me, that we can buy, which will be that a hedge fund will purchase a fleet CapEx, with a very deterministic outcome cash flow. They are the most efficient capital providers. They will securitize it across regions or maybe not. And then you can buy the cash flows from a specific region that's kind of an equivalent to GDP for that city or something, So there's going to
All
be a very,
tokenized, all tokenized on
sorry,
the blockchain, all tokenized on a blockchain.
and on Mars. Yeah, so you're right, but I think 30 years is a long time. And I don't think it'll be surprising to me if not only if people still buy cars. I would be surprised, to be honest, that if it's even legal to drive your own car. I think it'll be like equivalent to if you're in an accident and it turns out that you were drunk at the wheel. It doesn't matter if you're in the right or the wrong. You're the one who's liable just by virtue of being drunk. I think it'll be like that. Like, you can drive your own car, but if you do that and you get into an accident, it's your fault because humans are just going to be worse than autonomous drivers. And like, look, it happened with horse and carriage. There was a period of time where you could drive automobiles and ride horses on the same roads. And then now, if you try to take a horse on an interstate freeway, it's quite damning, quite illegal. And so I think self-driven vehicles won't be around in 30 years. But I do see, like, there's a lot of companies that are doing great, like Ford in particular. And I won't talk too much about our relationship with Ford, but they have an amazing R&D center building next generation vehicles in California, right? And so I think there's a lot of ex-Tesla folks who have gone to these automotive companies. I think that the leadership at some of them understand that there's existential threats, and then they will find alternative ways uh, to basically reinvent themselves. And if they don't, then they die. I mean, that's the reality of any business. Great question, Jason. I should have you be the interviewer on this podcast.
It's a much easier job.
Thank you so much for the time. It was really great to see you.
Great to see you, Spencer. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, thank you for joining the pod.